She's taught in a number of other institutions, including the Pan-African University and the translation program of the Protestant University of Central Africa, UPAC. She was involved in the first issue of the journal that I just mentioned, Critic, which came out in July 2020. So she was co-publisher of that. And she's published articles in a range of international journals as well. Tonight, she's talking to us on a very pertinent topic, which is the impact of COVID-19 on the translation market in Africa. So we're very glad to welcome you, Stephanie. And yeah, please do start.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine, for this long presentation of my bio note. Usually, I don't really want people to be focused on my bio, but since it is useful for members of the lab to know what I'm working on, I think it's quite a good thing. What I would like to say here first is that I've been working on a number of issues in translation, and I'm interested in how the translation market has been moving, how the translation market has been changing based on arguments in translation studies and also arguments in economics, in anthropology, in sociology. We all know that translation studies is a field that usually is like a carrefour, a jointure of disciplines. And it is very difficult to talk about translation studies without borrowing from other fields of studies. So the topic of this evening that I chose, that is impact of COVID-19 on the translation market in Africa, has an impetus. And the first reason is that since the beginning of the pandemic, media have been profusely talking about translation, the impact of the pandemic in China as a power in terms of economic exchange with the US, etc. But Africa is like a continent that has no voice. And I wanted to share this research with other people from other areas for us together to see whether the literature review or the views themselves can be shared. So I made a plan, an outlay of the plan, especially with a special focus on the world market of translation and the share of Africa on the world market of translation. We have been reading, we have been going through literature review in translation, on translation market, especially with Daniel Guadec, who has written a lot on the translation market in the Francophone area. But I wanted to show the position of Africa in this world market. Also, I will come back on the characteristics of the African market of translation, what is called language service providers, how the African market develops on within the translation industry, within the language service industry. And then I think from that we'll be able to cover the COVID-19 period that is it's a short period in the history of translation industry in Africa, but nonetheless, it is a very important time span in the history of translation in Africa too. And then we look at the perspective that will lead to discussions, because perspective like suggestions and projections of what we think the translation market can be and will be in Africa. So how does the world market of translation looks like? I guess all the people who listen to me can imagine, and there is much. There are many authors who have written about this, the shape of the world market of translation, with figures that we all know. But most important for me is to position the share of Africa within the world market of translation, because Africa is the continent that I must say is taken for granted within the translation industry, although the share of Africa is negligible. But we need to understand as scholars why and how Africa positions within this market, maybe to help stakeholders from Africa and from Europe and foreign countries to better position in this world market whole. So from the methodological point of view, I would like to come back on the who gives figures of the world market of translation. For me, it is important because it is difficult to find an organization in Africa, an African-based organization that can give these figures. Um, and I found that common sense advisory methodology was quite interesting and objective from the scientific point of view to assess the position of Africa within this big wall of market of translation. And then maybe the Index Translationum hosted by UNESCO from the United Nations. So these are figures that I will use, that I've found on the world market, and of course, very few figures from Africa that this common sense advisory gave to me. Apart from these two organizations, it is difficult, I must say that, and it is true that there is very few organizations that are interested in giving figures on the African market, African industry of translation as compared to the European or the foreign world of translation market. So also, what are the instruments used to analyze the translation industry? Here, I would like to defend the instruments they use to analyze the translation industry, still within the framework of their methodology. And I would like to highlight the Porter's 5 forces model used by the CSA, that is Common Sense Advisory, and the statistics approach of the UNESCO that the CSA also use in common with UNESCO. And then I would like to finish my talk with the world market of translation in figures. Of course, I will come back on it is important to understand the world market of translation and position Africa to understand the impact of COVID-19 on this African market of translation. So, Common Sense Advisory is an organization that has been founded in 2002, and it is an independent business international and globalization and localization translation research and firm that collects data on the translation market in the world. It runs surveys about the feelings of freelancers and agencies on the translation trends in the world within specific time spans, and at the same times and sometimes on a long run, short period, etc. So by the end, each year, Common Sense Services with the CSA comes up with the list of the top 20 language service providers in the world, and highlights the reasons or the arguments why these agencies are the top language service providers. I would like to anticipate and say that from 2010 to 2021, there has been no African language service providers understood as translation agency in Africa that has been listed among the top 100 language service providers. And this draws our attention on the reasons or the arguments that the CSA brings to that. And the Index Translationum is hosted by the UNESCO and has been founded in 1932, and it's a cumulative bibliography information on books that have been published in about 100 and of the member states since 1979, sorry, and 2009. And you can find 2,000 million entries in all disciplines. And I would like to emphasize on the fact that the Index Translationum is more interested in literary translation, whereas the CSA is more interested in technical translation. So the data collected by the CSA will be more useful to us within the framework of this talk. So the model used by the CSA, Catherine, I'm sorry if I'm fast, just let me know, because I don't want you to be like embarrassed with my pace. Is it okay?
It's perfect for me. Yeah, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I was saying that the CSA model, the model that the CSA is using is the Porter's 5 forces model. That focuses on the 5 elements to analyze data collected from about 97 countries, from many agencies from 97 countries, which is quite a good representative number in terms of data collection. And the 5, as you see in on my screen, the 5 elements of the Porter's forces model are the industry rivalry, the potential of new entrants into the industry, the power of suppliers, the power of customers, and the threat of substitutes. As far as the industry rivalry is concerned, they assume that the lower the competition, the greater the power of the company. And I would like us to keep it in mind when we will come on the power of the pandemic, on the changes that that the industry has undergone within the African continent. And then the potential of new entrants into the industry means that the less time or money that it costs to a new competitor on the market, the more the established company is weakened. So if there is a new company in the industry that settles within a short time and is funded with less financial support, then the more the already established company is weakened on the field. Then they use the power supply. This is the third force within the model. The third force is the power suppliers. The fewer the suppliers, the more a company will depend on the supplier. And within the translation industry, the translation market, in Europe, it is somehow obvious, but in Africa, we come back on it. We might have more suppliers and less dependence. So it's a little bit, it's like we are going, it is an opposite view of Porter's model. And the fourth element of the model is the power of customers. More customers there are, lower prices there are, and we have an increase of profitability. And the last element is the threat of substitutes. If there are no close substitutes, then you have more power to increase the price. So this is the model that the CSA uses to analyze the translation, the world translation market. Added to that, the CSA also used the custom program statistical software to carry out computations on multiple categories and validate data and changes in LSP data over previous years. This is from a chronological perspective. So they start with the Porter's 5 forces model, and then they end with this statistical computation. Whereas the index translationum is just an overview of data that have been sent by 193 member states out of 197 states of the United Nations. So I think it would be more interesting to rely on the CSA data than on the index translationum data and conclusions. So what does the world market looks like? You can see on the screen that you have, sorry, okay, a graph of the market size in billion US dollars from the year 2019 to the year 2021. And my data, I'm just quoting the data and the results of the survey of the CSA. And it has been acknowledged that from the year 2009 and to the year 2014, there has been a steady growth of the world market in translation. But from the year 2015 to 2021, although there have been an increase of the demand or in the translation market, the steadiness is no more the same. And this is the very question, the core question, the core issue of this presentation. That is why from 2009 to 2014, we have a steady growth. And then from 2015 to 2021, we have a very slow pace in terms of market share from Africa. And I came up with this statistics from the CSA showing that from 2010 to 2014, Northern America, Western Europe, Northern Europe, Asia, Southern Europe were leaders in terms of market share, and Africa was the last continent with 0.26% of this market share. But this is not the most interesting part of it, because from 2018, figures from 2018 show that the market share of Africa has reduced to 0.05%, whereas in 2014, we were at 0.26%. And the question was, why is the world market of translation dominated by Europe and Northern America, when it is not Europe or Northern America having the lead? When Europe does not have the lead, it is Northern America. And then Asia has a stable position in terms of market share. And Latin America and the Caribbean are always ahead of Africa, that is occupying the third position. And then the share of Africa is drastically decreasing from 0.26% in 2014 to 0.05% in 2018. Africa's share is always decreasing, while Asia has a stable position, and the world market is dominated by Europe and Northern America sharing the lead. So I wanted, after I asked myself that question, I had to find out what are the characteristics of the African market of translation, that is, of language service providers. And I had to draw the map of Africa as a whole in terms of languages, in terms of number of speakers, and the shape of entrepreneurship that my colleague Carlos Jomo has already presented, but I wanted to bring another aspect of the entrepreneurship in Africa that I think he did not highlight it enough, because I've seen his presentation. And then lastly, I wanted to present the regional leadership, because Africa is always presented as a whole, whereas when it comes to foreign countries, foreign continents, there's always a sort of split in terms of market shares, when Africa is also made of regional organizations. So, I'm quoting from the CSA that takes Africa as a whole instead of regional organizations, regional countries that have specific influences, specific diplomatic relations, specific translation exchanges, language exchanges. So Africa as a whole, there are 2,000 spoken languages within Africa, and Nigeria alone has more than 500 languages. And Nigeria is hosted by Western Africa. And in terms of number of speakers, the media use at least 242 African languages. The judicial system uses at a minimum of 63 African languages. Public administration uses 56 African languages, and there are tens of millions of people speaking Amharic, Berber, Hausa, Igbo, Oromo, Swahili, and Yoruba. So why is Africa the continent that has such a huge amount of languages, but having the less share of the translation market? That was my main a problem with this reflection. So, and I asked myself, why, if trade was the main baseline to assess the translation market, and when I'm talking about trade, it concerns um, total trade, intra-African trade, and inter-African regional trades, and then the trade between African countries and foreign countries. Um, and you can notice that the total trade from Africa to the rest of the world average 760 billion US dollar in current price from 2015 to 2017, as compared with 481 billion from Oceania, etc. So it means that Africa is a very important continent in the world, and it's like a trade junction of the world. But why is Africa remaining um, um, the continent where the market share is the least important? And it didn't make sense to me. And I questioned the intra-African exports, where 16.6% of total export in 2017, um, compared to 68.1% in Europe, 59.5% in Asia, etc. And now when it comes to intra-African trade, that I define as the average of intra-African exports and imports, that is average between exports and import, was around 2% during the same time span, 2015, 2017, as compared to figures in Asia, Europe, etc. Um, and it came to my mind that Africa is a continent where the translation market, when it comes to intra-regional exchange, should be obviously low, because um, countries speaking the same language are aggregating, or are like um, within the same area, so they don't need translation um, services. But now I'm more interested in translation between European languages and African languages from and into African languages. And there are countries that are very interesting, with a good amount of, in terms of number of speakers, countries that are very interesting. You see, Nigeria has, these are figures of 2016, figures of 2021, sorry. 2021 give Nigeria a population of 180 million people. Ethiopia is 96.6 million people. Egypt, 86.9. Congo Kinshasa, 77.4, and South Africa, 48.3. In terms of language combination, you have 46 countries with one official language, 16 countries with two official languages, one country only with three official languages, 10 countries having one official language and one European language, two countries speaking English and French, three countries speaking French and Arabic, six countries speaking Portuguese, and two countries speaking Spanish. And languages with the greatest number of speakers, you have Swahili, with 150 million Africans speaking Swahili in the region of Great Lakes in Central and Southern Africa. You have Arabic that we all know with 100 million Africans. French, 90 million speakers in Africa, making French one of the most preeminent language in terms of language combination in Africa. Meaning that when we come to the impact of COVID-19 on the African market, if French is targeted, then there will be a big problem. We have Hausa with 50 million Africans speaking that language, Yoruba, 30 million speakers, Oromo, 30 million people speaking Oromo in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Egypt. Igbo, 24 million people. isiZulu, 10 million. Amharic, 25 million. Most of them being in the region of in Ethiopia, and they mix it with Arabic. And Shona, over 10 million speakers. This means that there are African languages that have many speakers, and that can be a good area for translation markets. Then what are the problems that people, let's say agencies and freelancers face when we have this wealth in terms of languages? And I'll come on the picture of my colleague Carlos Jomo in terms of service provision through third parties, service provision to direct clients, service provision via hybrid methods, etc., to give the reasons why, though we have so many speakers, we can't have, or we don't have a good market share. We have largest language service providers. We have translators, platform, generic freelancers, sites, but the most important problem is subcontracting. And I remain on this first elements highlighted by Carlos Jomo in terms of translation management in Africa. What happens is that we have international firms that control the international market and that are based in foreign countries. And they invade the African market for better visibilities, for calls for tenders. It's like they duplicate on the African ground. You will have, for instance, large firms like Central Language Solutions that is now duplicating in Ghana, but still for the American market. This duplication is meant for control of local markets on international calls for tenders. They use their international reputation on African ground to have a strategic advantage on call for tenders, and then African agencies are just behaving as subcontractors and handle translation tasks. That is why African agencies cannot be account for the African market, and that can stand as an argument for the 0.05% of the market share. So the problems that these African agencies face are the slow flow of projects, the fact that they have been subcontractors, they are poorly managed, and the contracts with external or foreign firms are unstable. And even when they have contracts with local clients, the contracts are not stable. These are usually contracts that run on 1 year renewable. They also have, from the internal perspective, problems of taxation and insurance. They have no support from the state. There is the issue of internet connectivity. They have professional membership on platforms. They don't see the impact of technology on the growth of their on their agencies. And there's a problem of capacity building. Usually in Africa, those who are owners of translation agencies are translators, and they don't go under training as managers of translation agencies. And either they close very soon, or the pace of the projects just slows down. And they also have issues on software, hardware, etc. So all these impede on the survival of agencies. And I don't even want to talk about freelance translators who also have their own problems on the field. So I drew a sketch of the leadership in Africa based on the statistics of Proscom, that is the most common platform of translation companies and freelancers, the oldest platform and the most professional, in my opinion. Maybe it is subjective because I'm the local representative of Proscom in Cameroon, but I came up with 5 leaders in terms of regional perspective. In Western Africa, you have Nigeria. In Central Africa, you have Cameroon. In Eastern Africa, you have Kenya. In Northern Africa, you have Egypt. And in Southern Africa, you have South Africa, sorry. And you can see the number of companies and the level of registration, their interest in their visibility, their online visibility, that of course will have an impact on their development during the period of COVID-19. In Nigeria, you will see that you have 76 plus companies that are registered, but none of them has paid their registration fees so far, even though they make themselves visible, but they don't have access to full advantages offered by this platform. So it's like we have agencies that act locally, but want to be visible internationally. In Cameroon, you have 45 pros companies registered, but 3 that have access to the standard package. You have no enterprise, you have 0 plus enterprise registered. So and we can move on with Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. And you can understand that technology, the use of technology before COVID-19 will have an impact on the period of COVID-19 and the health crisis in the world. So if you look at this map, you can see that Africa is poorly, but very poorly represented in terms of virtual visibility. So you have companies that are somehow web-based company, but web-based companies, but that don't have a visibility abroad, or let's say further than the geographical area where they develop. So this is one of the technological issue, is one of the main issue that should be taken into consideration when it comes to the analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on the African translation market. So what is the world market looking like during the COVID-19, and I gathered a number of um, articles, blogs, and CSA reports that helped me to understand and make a synthesis of what actually is the impact or has been the impact of COVID-19 on in the world translation market. And then I brought it back to the influence on the African market of translation. So there was a world survey of August 2020, that is few months after the world has been confined and been going through a health crisis. And I think this survey interviewed 1,174 translators in 97 countries in the world. And the results are that a number of them, or many of them, think that there was a decline in revenues. There was the workload, sorry, was a little bit lower. There was a reduced amount of work, and very few requests for cuts of rate. 65% of survey participants believe that COVID-19 has temporarily changed the market. And this is a percentage that should be kept in mind when it comes to Africa, because this 65% is quite significant when you have to analyze the impact of the COVID-19 on the world market and on the African market of translation. 25% think that it has changed the world market permanently, but this is compared to the 65%. I would say it can be negligible as an opinion. And then 10% only think that it has not changed. But I'm quite sure that if we go through the report of the CSA again, this 10% concern freelancers rather than agencies. I did not want to go through the opinions of freelancers because there's subjectivity aspects that we cannot check scientifically. So I limited myself to translation agencies whose figures could be more reliable. And then the request for translation increased in some domains, for instance, marketing, on-site translation, medical translation, and document translation. And the most important here is to underline that medical translation has known a very important, let's say, a significant increase in terms of demand, or in terms of request for translation during the period of COVID-19, with pharmaceutical firms, surveys in all the countries, and all this relates to the health crisis. And since language services provide a view of the temperature of how well or how good the world is, I think that it should be taken into consideration, or we should highlight that the medical translation sector has a great input in the shape of the translation market during the COVID-19. And if you look at this picture of the wordpoint.com, you'll see that the customer growth is that study that has been carried out during the period of COVID-19. You see that the customer growth was expected to increase by 17% during quarantine. That is 400% of employers started working remotely. Of course, when we talk about people, LSPs working remotely, we are not specifically referring to translators. We also focusing on interpreters whose expertise was more impacted or influenced by the changes brought by the COVID-19. And then the number of online orders from December to January gradually and steadily increased, or like the most requested language were restricted to Chinese, English, Italian, and Spanish. When we know that in Africa there were intra-regional languages that were also part of the translation market. So when the what should be understood here is that when foreign countries, I don't want to talk about Europe only, Europe, Americas, etc., when the pace or the number of languages is restricted, Africa also is also influenced by this restrictive uh, um, elements of the translation market. So what is the influence on what was really the influence on the African market? I highlighted a number of languages. If you see the screen, you'll see that Swahili, Amharic, Hausa, and Yoruba, I highlighted them because they were already languages that were part of the translation, intra-regional translation market. But there are some other languages that came up with COVID-19 because most NGOs needed to sensitize populations on the dangers of the pandemic. And then we not there was an increase of the translation market in all these non-highlighted languages. And there were also languages like Twi, Ewe, Mandika, Wolof, Fulani, Sepedi, Setswana, Luganda, etc., that grew in terms of demand. Whereas, as far as European languages are concerned in Africa, you will notice that English and Spanish remain the languages that were still among the most demanded. French and Portuguese demand decreased. So we have an increase of demand in English and Spanish in Africa, and then an increase of of the demand in African languages, apart from highlighted languages that were already subject to translation in this part of the world. So this was for translation. Interpretation is another issue, and it's a different situations. Sorry, a different situation. All over the world, since the world, many countries decided that people should be confined. There were no more events, so conferences, symposiums were cancelled or postponed. So interpreters had no more work, and the pandemic has closed other sectors of activity, such as trade and tourism, that were also domains of expertise, um, some domains of expertise that were highly demanded. So there was an important decrease in terms of trade and tourism, but the sector of health, and medical translation not has known a very important increase. So what's going on in the world impacted or influenced or affected the African market of translation that was already in a sort of that already had its own peculiarities in terms of incomes, in terms of technologies, in terms of training, etc. So even the change of work methods had an impact on the way interpreters in Africa were affected by the pandemic. We know that the specificities of Africa it is somehow difficult to understand when you have not yet experienced internet condition issues in Africa, or microphone cards, or poor quality of interpretation material, etc. But these are realities that are specific to Africa. And since the interpretation sector has to move to remote interpreting, it was a little bit brutal and sudden for African interpreters, and also accounted for the slowness um, of this sector of activity. So there was a lack of appropriate co-working areas, sorry, because interpreting in Africa is known, or is defined as being done in interpretation booths. So co-working areas just burst just like that as a resilient method of interpreters, or survival methods for interpreters to occupy the interpretation space. So there was a poor culture of co-working. The when the interpreters had um, to be resilient to the new remote interpretation space, there was a soundproof space, because they did not know how to use technological material. And I would like to correlate it to the training in interpretation and translation schools, where where remote interpretation is not taught as an interpretation, or kind, or sort of a type of interpretation. So platforms like Zoom, WebEx, Microsoft Teams were completely, for most of the regions of Africa, maybe except Northern Africa and Southern Africa, but most African training school in their curricula have not included this technological material in their own training, and this made it difficult for interpreters to make it during the COVID-19 pandemic. So to sum up, I would say that the COVID-19 had an influence and has affected the African market on translation in terms of revenues, in terms of working method, in terms of resilience towards the foreign markets, because in terms of income, the demand in French and Portuguese has dropped. And if this demand drops, it means that the incomes of translators on the continent has also dropped. And I'm sorry that I could not, I had to use an inductive method of analysis because figures are hardly uh, to get when it comes to the African market of translation. Even the CSA hardly provides details on the figures of relating to the African market of translation. When I mean the CSA does not have figures concerning this market, is regional figures that can enable to have an aggregate shape of what the African market really looks like in terms of economical revenue. So even the domains of expertise have been restricted during this pandemic and narrowed the opportunities for translators in Africa, because when you see the curricula of most of the translation schools in Africa, you will notice that these are not curricula that are purpose-oriented. Africa trains translators, but not experts in either medical translation or legal translation, or they just train translators, not specific or experts in X or Y domains, and the pandemic just came and brought up this let's say this lack of training. Also, in terms of in terms of change of working methods, I must say that the interpretation sector was the most affected. The translation market was affected, but interpretation sector was the most affected by the pandemic due to the need for interpreters to be more resilient in terms of technological manipulation. Um, Interpreters are trained on the continent as in most schools, but not all schools, but in most schools, they are trained for booth interpretation, but not for remote interpretation. That is why the market was a little bit brutal for them when the world entered in confinement. So Africa should will always be a resilient continent, um, resilient toward the foreign market, because the demand is not only the demand is initiated by foreign contractors, but trainings do not anticipate on the world changes so far. So from these are my own perspectives, and I'm responsible, of course, for what I'm saying. And I think that unless African states start supporting language service providers' activities on the continent, the industry will be resilient and dependent on the foreign market of language service providers. Also, the situation of interpretation in Africa will not change until Europe sees its total confinement. What I mean is that most interpreters rely on conferences abroad, that is out of their own countries. Now, even if Africa is no more under confinement and Europe is still going through a series of confinement until these confinements um, come to an end in Europe, African interpreters will still face problems in their own careers in terms of income and even their movement on the globe. And also the share of Africa will keep decreasing. This is my opinion. The share of Africa will keep decreasing. That is from 0.05% downwards, since the transition market is correlated to international market. If African states do not support translation agencies on site, then African agencies, translation agencies or language providers in Africa will still be subcontracting or will still be subcontractors of European multinationals, and this is quite obvious. And finally, the market of translation into African languages, even if it has increased slightly, thanks to the need for sensitizations against the pandemic, this should not be taken for granted, because as soon as the pandemic is over, these languages will still be put aside to give a way to official languages, that is colonial languages that are prevalent on the translation market. Thank you for listening. I hope that I've not taken much of your time, and I'm sure that this talk can be improved thanks to your comments and question. Thank you, Catherine.